Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm excited again to get into week 2 here. We called this one David on the Run. So we're going to go back now. Last week, so I wanted to review, but last week we kind of did a story in Psalm number 3, which was at the end of David's life, or near the end of David's life, when he's running from his son Absalom. So this week we're going to come much more close to the beginning when he is coming out of his service of Saul. So we're gonna skip his super early life when he's living with his father, and then we're skipping David and Goliath, and he comes to become a general of Saul, and then Saul kind of pushes him away. So then when that happens, he goes on the run, right? And that's what we're talking about, because David wrote a ton of Psalms at this time. I think more than even the ones that we're kind of looking at today. And it's a really interesting time. The big lesson today is to trust in God's timing, because as we're going to look at, I'm going to show it to you in just a minute here, David was anointed by God to be the king of Israel, but then he was given opportunity to kind of take that kingship, like take it for himself, not given to him by God. So God chose him to be the king. And then he has multiple times where he could be the king, but he's kind of patient and trusts in God's timing before that is given to him. So it's a really interesting thing, I think, in our lives, because I don't know, I grew up where you take what is given to you, or you pursue every opportunity that you have, or you think about what's most important for you in your professional career or whatever. And or whatever your life has, but David shows a really amazing patience and trust in God that I think we're going to see kind of displayed tonight, because he chooses to run from Saul instead of stopping to face him, even though he's a more popular kind of character. So I'm going to jump into my slides now, and we're going to get into this. So I got to go to here. Share screen, and then go here, and where's the display button? There we go. Okay, so like I said, David's diary, David on the run. Last week was our introduction. This week we're looking at David on the run, and then next week we'll look at David in the caves. David and the wedding of his son, and David in the temple. That's our 5-week program. I wanted to remember that kind of the basis of our thoughts here is these headers. So there's 14 Psalms. We're going to look at all of them over these 5 weeks, where if you look at that, what I've displayed, it says Psalm 3 from the ESV, "Save me, oh my God." That's the editorial header. So that's whatever the translation is that I pulled this offline. They said, "Save me, oh my God." And then the words that are in italics there, a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son, that is actually in the text. So it's in the Bible text. So I put it there on the right, a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. That is these Hebrew words here. And this is the Psalm that we looked at in week 1. So what we're doing is we're trying to look at David's life and the events in his life that have these Psalms tied to it exactly. So we know exactly what he wrote about after he experienced certain things. So that's what we're doing over these 5 weeks. I just wanted to repeat that because I think it's fascinating that those headers, the headers of the Psalms, not the editorial headers, not kind of the big, and it's different in every Bible, but kind of the big headers are usually in kind of a bold or a larger print, and then the headers that are actually in the original Hebrew manuscripts are in an italics or a smaller print. So that's what we're looking at. So I mentioned it before, and let's think about this. Flip to 1 Samuel 16. If you look in your Bibles to 1 Samuel 16. In 1 Samuel 16, we get to the anointing of David. So in 1 Samuel chapter 16, David is chosen. Oh, where is it? Oh, that's the failure. That's the failure of Saul. I think I put that. I think I have that wrong. I think it's earlier. Oh. No, yeah, 1 Samuel 16. I was looking in chapter 15 by accident. 1 Samuel 16. Samuel arrives to Bethlehem. So this is immediately after the failure of King Saul. And he comes to Bethlehem. This is Samuel, the prophet, he's the last judge at this time in 1 Samuel 16. And he gets to verse 6. It says, "Then it came about when they entered, he looked at Eliab." This is the oldest of Jesse's oldest son. Said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So Samuel works through all of Jesse's sons and then gets to the last one right there in verse 11. "And Samuel said to Jesse, 'Are these all the children?' And he said, 'There remains yet the youngest. And behold, he is tending the sheep.' Then Samuel said to Jesse, 'Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here.' So he went and brought him in, and he was ruddy with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, 'Arise, anoint him, for this is he.' And Saul took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah." So it's an interesting story that David, this famous painting really displays it perfectly. David, a young boy, is anointed by Samuel, the last judge, a very powerful prophet from God, and told that he would be king. And he's told that as a young boy. Now from there, we're going to skip over it, but we're going to look at chapter 17 is David defeating Goliath, probably one of the most famous stories in the Bible. David defeats Goliath, and then Saul makes David one of his generals. Fascinating, because now Saul begins to kind of fail the people, as he'd actually already had. He failed the people in chapter 15. So keep in mind that Saul has already started to disappoint God. That's why Samuel had anointed the next king. And he continues to do so. But David trusts in God's timing and not his own. And that, to me, is the big lesson from today and from kind of the events that we see right after this, that David trusts. He has a complete faith in God, that God's timing for the events in his life are what's best for him. And that is a very powerful concept, very difficult. I think we can experience it through all parts of our life, even now, trying to be followers of God. I think about a single person when they're waiting to be married in the Lord. There can be a big frustration, that the mate that God has designed for them has not come along, and sometimes we can go outside of what God wants and not trust in God's timing. I think of looking for a better job. Sometimes it becomes very difficult to know when you should leave the job that you're at to find the next job that you should be at. I think about when you're married and maybe you want to have children. I think many people have had some extreme pain not being given the children that they wanted, and then retirement. Is it the right time to retire, or where should I live, or all sorts of anguish. How do you take care of your parents? Things like that all through life. It's very hard to figure out what is God's timing and what is our own timing. What issues are we rushing? What issues are we not having faith in God that He's going to take care of these things? And then what issues are we taking over on by our own, making our own decisions? And David is a really interesting example because he is a man who trusts in God's timing. He trusts that God is going to take care of these things. So we're going to see that now when David starts to go on the run. So we're going to look at a bunch of verses here. So David kills Goliath. now is a good time when I'm looking over these chapters. I'm actually using the headers, the editorial headers that the translator has put in. So we know David in the middle of chapter 17. Chapter 18, he starts to become a friend to Jonathan, David's son, who would be essentially the crown prince. He marries he befriends Jonathan, who's Saul's son. Then he marries Saul's daughter, Michal, but then Saul begins to turn on him. So we can see that in verse 10 of chapter 18. I've listed that passage there on the slide. Now it came about on the next day. This is 18, chapter 10. Well, actually, let's back up a little bit. Verse 5 of chapter 18, 1 Samuel 18. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. And the women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands? Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul sees in this song, in the people's popularity, that they're choosing David over him. And he doesn't like this at all. So verse 9, and Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. 1 Samuel 18, verse 9. And that gets us to verse 10. Now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual. And a spear was in Saul's hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped. Oh no. But David escaped from his presence. Sorry, the dog got barking there. But David escaped from his presence twice. So interesting there that Saul turns his spirit, right, due to the popularity that he was, that the people were showing David. Saul becomes very frustrated and kind of disillusioned, and then I think even has a mental issue in verse 10, and throws that spear at David, the man who had saved his people. And it happens again if you look at the next chapter. Now we were skipping over. David does marry Michal, who we're going to see later tonight. And then if you skip over and you look at verse 9. Sorry, the dog. Now the air conditioning turned on, so he hates the air conditioning. Chapter 19, verse 9. Now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul, as he was sitting in the house with his spear in his hand. And David was playing the harp with his hand. And Saul tried to pin David to the wall with a spear. So I'm in 1 Samuel 19. We're seeing the second time that Saul attacked David. But he slipped away out of Saul's presence, so that he stuck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, now that's the daughter of Saul, told him, saying, If you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. And Michal took the household item and laid it on the bed, and put a quilt of goat's hair in his head, and covered it with the clothes. When Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, He is sick. So we're hearing this story now. I'm reading of Saul's own soldiers surrounding David's house. And Michal, his wife, tells him a lie there in verse 14, saying he is sick. So Saul sent messengers again to see David, saying in verse 15, Bring him up to me on his bed, that I may put him to death. When the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed, with the quilt of goat's hair at its head. So Saul said to Michal, Why have you deceived me like this, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? And Michal said to Saul, He said to me, Let me go. Why should I put you to death? Now David fled and escaped, and came to Samuel at Ramah, and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. So an interesting time there, that David now is so unpopular with Saul that he sends his own soldiers to try and kill him at his house, right? But we see there in the picture, he escapes and gets away. Now look again, he leaves there, goes and meets with Samuel, then comes back and tries to meet with Jonathan, which becomes a problem eventually for Jonathan. And then when he becomes, when he really has to go on the run, so we're skipping over the story of Jonathan and David in chapter 20, but I want to look just at the end, just to the last verse. Jonathan said to David, this is verse 42 of chapter 20. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. And then David came to know, but that's in the beginning of chapter 21. And then looking, I've got another issue there. Chapter 21 doesn't have 40 verses. Oh no, that's what I'm trying to read. Chapter 20. Those are the verses I read. So look at let's read it again. So that's 1 Samuel 20, 40 to 42. When the lad was gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed three times, and they kissed each other and wept together, but David more. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord." So David, before he is sent away even by his friend Jonathan, because he knows things have gone wrong. So it's time for David to kind of head out on the run. So Jonathan even tells David, you can't really live in the king's house anymore. You need to go on. We have to separate, and that's what happens there at the end of chapter 20. So turn with me to Psalm 59. So Psalm 59 is going to be our first one we're going to look at here. And Psalm 59 covers this really sad story of David being surrounded in his house. So if you're already at Psalm 59, you can see again the chapter. I have a header that's an editorial header. It says "Prayer from Deliverance from Enemies," and then here it is, the header that's in the text. For the choir director, set to Al-Tasheth, a miktam of David. And Saul sent men, and they watched the house in order to kill him. So that's the story that we just read there in 1 Samuel 19. The story of his own house being surrounded with the house that he had with Michal, and now him having to escape. So let's look. We're going to read Psalm 59, 17 verses, but I'd like to read through it, and then we'll take a look at different verses that apply to this experience. Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Set me securely on high, away from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from those who do iniquity, and save me from the men of bloodshed. For behold, they have set an ambush for my life. Fierce men launch an attack against me. Not for my transgression, nor for my sin, O Lord. For no guilt of mine, and they run and set themselves against me. Arouse thyself to help me and see. Even those first few verses, we can see David asking God to protect him from those people who set an ambush against him. That's what it would feel like if your house was surrounded by soldiers. And then for no guilt of mine, he had done nothing wrong. He had done nothing wrong at all. It's only Saul's jealousy, and God's will through Saul that arises this this violence against David. In verse 5, "And thou, O Lord, God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to punish all the nations. Do not be gracious to any who are treacherous in iniquity. They return at evening, they howl like a dog and go around the city. Behold, they belch forth with their mouths, swords are in their lips. For they say, who hears? But thou, O Lord, dost laugh at them. Thou dost scoff at all the nations. Because of his strength I will watch for thee, for God is my stronghold. My God and his loving kindness will meet me. God will let me look triumphantly upon my foes. Do not slay them, lest my people forget. Scatter them by thy power and bring them down. O Lord, our shield, on account of the sin of their mouth and the words of their lips, let them even be caught in their pride. And on the account of curses and lies which they utter, destroy them in wrath. Destroy them that they may be no more. That men may know that God rules in Jacob to the ends of the earth. And they return at evening, they howl like a dog. That's the same as verse 6, verse 14 there. And go around the city. They wander about for food and growl if they are not satisfied. But as for me, I shall sing of thy strength. Yes, I shall joyfully sing of thy loving kindness in the morning. For thou hast been my stronghold and a refuge in the day of my distress. O my strength, I will sing praises to thee, for God is my stronghold, the God who shows me his loving kindness. So the notes of this psalm are interesting. I've done no wrong right there in verse 4. I highlighted it before. He hadn't done anything wrong. King David had not made a mistake, really, against the Lord. He had followed every direction that Saul had given him, and it was just the kind of the evil that had overtaken Saul that had brought Saul against him. And that is frustrating, I think, even for us as believers, that we are people who will do what the Bible tells us, and it's perceived as some sort of evil in the world in some cases, and that can be very frustrating. And then both, like I noted, both verse 6 and both verse 14 are exactly the same. And I think it's interesting that they say return at evening, because this is the psalm that he writes in that reaction from this experience of escaping from his own house. And then if you look at verse 16, I'm jumping down to the bottom of my list here. I shall sing of thy strength. Yes, I shall joyfully sing of the loving kindness in the morning. Right? So verse 6 and verse 14 are the same. And then verse 16 refers to the morning. So we can really see the tie-ins of this psalm to this event where he's trying to escape his own house. The men surround him in the evening, and then he escapes and is given salvation, the loving kindness of God. God is his stronghold there in verse 16, because he's still living in the morning. And then repeatedly, I want to come back to that verse 8 point. But repeatedly, he refers to the people surrounding him as dogs. There in verse 11. Verse 6, verse 14, and verse 15. Again, those same verses, they're referred to as dogs. And then verse 11, do not slay them, lest that my people forget. Scatter them by thy power and bring them down. See, David knows these are not really his enemies in this kind of story. These are people, confused, I would think, in their intentions, and making mistakes in a way. So people who are enemies of God, but really not really enemies of David. These are Saul's men. These are people he might have served with in Saul's army. So the harder verses are there in verse 8. But thou, O Lord, dost laugh at them. Thou dost scoff at all the nations. And then I pointed that out. It also says all the nations in verse 5. And that part was hard for me. How do we explain in this story? We read the story in Samuel, and now we read the psalm in Psalm 59. What are the other nations that David's talking about? Because he was surrounded by Israelites. He's an Israelite. He was surrounded by Israelites in that home. They were the messengers of Saul. They weren't really other nations. And then laughing at them was interesting too. But I think that is actually pretty common in Psalms. And I think so. Let's look at these other two verses I put. Psalm 2 verse 4 explains it a little bit. Psalm 2 verse 4. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury. And then Psalm 37 verse 13. Psalm 37 verse 13. Verse 12. Well, the wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes at him with his teeth. The Lord laughs at him, for he sees his day is coming. It's a really common poetic thing that I think shows up also in this Psalm 59, that God laughs at the ones who live outside of his plan. I think we've said it. You may have heard the famous phrase, "We make plans and God laughs." It's really the same thing that David understands, that there's this idea that you could oppose God, but what's the point of that? And I think even David understands that, and that is why he mentions laughing. But the other nations is interesting, because I don't think I have the perfect answer for that. I think there's a possibility, and I read this, and I think I'm okay with it, that this psalm is also pointing towards just the persecution that Jesus Christ himself feels from other nations and from the Gentile, maybe from the Romans at the time of his death. And that might make these verses make more sense, that there still is a final judgment to come, a final judgment to come for the sinful nations that surround the people and kind of affect the thinking of the Israelites. So it's not and that makes me think that this psalm is not like when we read Psalm 3, it really feels in Psalm 3 that is an exact reaction. We're going to read a couple more of this through this study. I think there's some that are like immediate reactions to the events, and some that might be reactions when he's thinking back on these times, right? He's using the emotions that he felt of escaping his own house, and then looking back at that, and then thinking, well, let me write this song or this poem, in which case he could think about the persecution of other nations, because it doesn't fit exactly that the other nations were those who were surrounding him in his house. So that doesn't make sense exactly with the story that we read in 1 Samuel, but I do think it's still a true statement, right? It's still a true statement that there are other nations in David's time that would set themselves up against God. So let's look at the next one. So this is the next story. So now David is on the run. He's left his house with Michal, and then we run into this really interesting story in 1 Samuel 21. So again, I'm skipping Jonathan. So through these whole chapters, and we're rushing through these chapters, there's all sorts of interactions with Jonathan, and Jonathan is the prince. He's the son of Saul. But we get to David on the run, and he comes to Nob and Ahimelech the priest. This is 1 Samuel 21 verse 1, and he has this interaction with Nob, and he asks with Ahimelech. He asks him for food, and they give him the food out of the temple, and he asks him for the sword of Goliath, and then Ahimelech kind of helps him out, and then David moves on to the Philistines, which we'll talk about later, and then goes on to the cave of Adullam, which we'll talk about next week, there in the beginning of chapter 22. But look here, come with me to chapter 22. We're going to start at verse 7, and we're going to read the story of Doeg the Edomite, because David writes specifically about Doeg the Edomite in the Psalms. So I want to look at chapter 22, verse 7. And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjaminites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse." And he's talking about Jonathan. He's frustrated that his lieutenants and his soldiers won't tell him when Jonathan has become a friend of David. "There is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is to this day." Then Doeg the Edomite, it's a funny name, Doeg the Edomite, there in verse 9, who was standing by the servants of Saul, answered and said, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and provided him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household of the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. And David said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse," now that's David, when he says son of Jesse, Jesse was David's father, "conspired against me, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise up against me by laying in ambush, as it is in this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the household of my father. Your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair." But the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household." Very sad that Saul is at a point where he's willing to kill priests, willing to kill people chosen by God to serve the people. And the king said to the guards who were attending him, "Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand is also with David, because they knew that he was fleeing, he did not reveal it to me." But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. And you can't blame them. I think that's very, very, that'd be a very hard thing to be told by your king to kill a priest. Not a position I'd want to be in. Then the king said to Doeg, so there's Doeg again, the same guy from verse 9, the snitch, the person who had told Saul where David was and what he had done. He says to him in verse 18, "You turn around and attack the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep, he struck with the edge of the sword. That's the story of Doeg the Edomite, a really terrible person that he was willing to kill priests, and then not even priests, but their women and children, and even their animals there in verse 9. So David talks about Doeg in Psalm 52. So turn back to Psalms, flip back over there to Psalm 52, and we'll see the psalm about Doeg. And there it is, the header again for the choir director, a maskil of David. When Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said to him, "David has come to the house of Ahimelech." And that's what we read there in 1 Samuel 22. "Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The loving kindness of God endures all day long. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor, O worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, falsehood more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living. And the righteous will see and fear and will laugh at him, saying, 'Behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and was strong in his evil desire. But as for me, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the loving kindness of God forever and ever. I will give thee thanks forever because thou hast done it, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good in the presence of thy godly one.'" So this one is pretty straightforward, but I think it was interesting. He is clearly an evil man. In those first 7 verses, it's kind of divided. Psalm 52, the first 7 verses are divided from the last 2 because the first 7 are describing exactly Doeg. The evil man, we see right there, "Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man?" In verse 1, "You love evil more than good." In verse 3, and then at the end of verse 7, "He was strong in his evil desire." I mean, there's nothing more evil than, as we read, than killing the priests. Just a disgusting decision that someone could make. And then he calls out his tongue specifically in verse 2. "Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor, a worker of deceit." Verse 4, "You love all the words that devour, O deceitful tongue." And he boasts of evil. It says that over and over, and that I think fits as well with the attitude that Saul had back in 1 Samuel 22. Both Saul and Doeg at this point in Samuel 22 are just shameless evil people. And then it trusted in riches. So it says in verse 7, "Behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of riches." That's, I think, a specific callback to verse 7 of chapter of 22, verse 7. So if you kept your hand in 1 Samuel 22, you flip right back, and it says, "And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, 'Hear now, O Benjaminites, will the son of Jesse give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds?'" So Saul was offering a reward to people who would be on his side. He was offering riches and honor, and that's something that Doeg couldn't resist. So that's what led to kind of Doeg's downfall. But still, it's encouraging that David, even recognizing this evil in Doeg, in this bad man, he has the attitude of seeing these last 2 verses. right? But as for me, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the loving kindness, that's the mercy of God forever and ever. I will give thanks forever, because thou hast done it, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good in the presence of thy godly ones. So David still has the eternal mindset, right? Trusting in God's judgment, trusting in God's timing. I also think it's interesting because we're gonna talk about this in the 5th week. David's passion for the temple. David was a man who wanted God to have a temple. He wanted God to have a place that he could worship in. And if you notice, he mentions that in both of these verses, verse 8 and verse 9. He says, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God, there in verse 8. And then also in the presence of thy godly ones, I will wait on thy name in the presence of the godly ones, there in verse 9. So it is something that David is very passionate about. So this Psalm 52, just ties perfectly with that story of Doeg. And we can see the healthy mindset that David has, that we should also try to have.
Can we make one comment?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
I was just thinking, because you made that comment about what about the other nations in Psalm 59?
Yeah.
Then it's very clear that Doeg here is an Edomite.
Right.
And like you just said, I was just connecting dots when you were saying things like Saul bribed people sort of to follow him and be loyal to him, but he couldn't even get his own people to kill the priests. But this Edomite was willing to do that. So maybe David, even in the Michal incident, maybe Saul has started surrounding himself sort of with people that are his henchmen, bodyguards from other nations or something, because they'll do whatever he tells them and have no conscience about it or something. That could have something to do with how David feels other nations are encroaching, and this Doeg incident is a real example of that.
Right, and actually, that's a perfect segue to the Ziphites, because the Ziphites. So in the next chapter, so we're kind of covering a bunch of chapters here in 1 Samuel. The Ziphites are in this story in chapter 23. David kind of fights for the Philistines, and I don't know if we'll talk about the Philistines tonight. And if you look in verse 15 of chapter 23, or verse 14, David stayed in the wilderness in the strongholds and remained in the hill country in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. Now David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life. I'm in verse 15. While David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. So the Ziph is right on the edge of Israel's land at the time. So definitely Philistine, I would say definitely foreigners, right? A foreign nation. So that's a really good point there. You have Doeg the Edomite, and then now you'll see the Ziphites are another people that kind of sell David out. So look at, let's see, actually, Jonathan comes, and again, I feel, we're rushing through a lot of chapters because we're trying to tie these stories directly to the Psalms. But Jonathan comes again there in verse 16, comes to visit David at Horesh and encourages him. I'm going to jump to verse 18. The two of them made a covenant with the Lord, and David stayed at Horesh while Jonathan went to his house. Then Ziphites, this is verse 19, then Ziphites came up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is David not hiding with us in the strongholds at Horesh, on the hill of Hekeliah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? Now then, O king, come down according to all the desire of your soul to do so, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. So David is sold out by these people who are the Ziphites. Funny name, the Ziphites, but David writes about that in Psalm 54. So it's another foreign nation. Great point. Another foreign nation that kind of sides with Saul and opposes David. So we'll read Psalm 54. Psalm 54 is also just 7 verses, so we'll get through this here. Look at the header right there. For the choir director on stringed instruments, a maskil of David, when the Ziphites came and said to Saul, is not David hiding himself among us? So it's an exact tie to that verse in 1 Samuel 23. Save me, O God, by thy name, and vindicate me by thy power. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers have risen against me, and violent men have sought my life, and have not set God before them. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is the sustainer of my soul. He will recompense the evil to my foes. Destroy them in thy faithfulness. Willingly I will sacrifice to thee. I will give thanks to thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me from all trouble, and my eye has looked with satisfaction upon my enemies. So this is a pretty straightforward again, the same as Doeg. What's interesting about when he says, surely God is my help, he says that in verse 4, behold, God is my helper, the Lord is the sustainer of my soul. If we had read all of 1 Samuel 23, when you're going through this, maybe when you're doing your own Bible reading, what's interesting is specifically in this chapter, and it's very odd, God speaks to David specifically. Look at verse 2. So flip back to 1 Samuel 23. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines. So it's kind of a very unique relationship that David has with God at this time, probably communicating through his angels. That there he asks God a question, he gets an answer right away. Verse 11, will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down just as thy servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell thy servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. And in verse 12, and David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. So we see that David saying, God is my help, that God is my helper, the sustainer of my soul, is very real for David at this time. When he's writing this psalm, he knows that God is with him. And then, verse 3, like I say here on the slide, for strangers have risen against me, and violent men have sought my life. So as I said, Ziph was a border town named after tar pits. So these are Gentiles. These are not Jewish people. And I think it's interesting that in verse 6, it's a specific mention of a sacrifice. So in the ESV, I think it says free will offering or thanksgiving offering in some of your versions. And I think that's fascinating because David is defining himself as a person of God, not a person of living after a selfish way, or like these Ziphites, not trusting in God. And then deliver me from trouble, there in verse 6. So willingly I will sacrifice thee, I will give thanks to thy name. Verse 7, for he has delivered me from all trouble, and my eyes looked upon satisfaction from my enemies. Well, when he escapes from Saul, so the Ziphites sell him out. If you flip back to 1 Samuel 23, the Ziphites sell him out, and he escapes from Saul, and then he names the place. So in verse 28, 1 Samuel 23, he names that place the Rock of Escape. Interesting that he calls that, he has to be delivered from trouble in verse 6, and then names it the Rock of Escape there in 1 Samuel 23, verse 28. So interesting time there in David's life, with again the Ziphites, another foreign nation, coming against him as he's trying to run away. So our last one I want to look at is David in Gath, or in the court of Abimelech or Achish, excuse me. So flip back. We already covered this chapter. So flip back here in 1 Samuel to chapter 21. What happens is he leaves Ahimelech. This is very confusing because we're using Ahimelech and Abimelech. And I'm going to explain that. Now, he leaves Ahimelech, and this is before Doeg, before the priests are killed. And in 1 Samuel 21, verse 10, David arose and fled that day from Saul, went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing for this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, the king of Gath. Now, Gath is a Philistine city. It's a major Philistine city. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down into his beard. So yes, very odd that he is that he acts crazy, but then that leads to Achish kind of letting him go. And Achish said to his servant, "Behold, you see the man is behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this one to act a madman in my presence? So is this one come into my house?" So David, and then if you go to chapter 22, David departs in there and escapes to the cave of Adullam, which is, again, what we'll be looking at next week, David kind of in the caves. So this relates to two specific Psalms. It says it exactly about these two stories. If you come to Psalm 56, the same story is related to two Psalms. And it's hard for me to, I spent a ton of time on this, and I can't really understand exactly. So I wanted to, we're going to close with this one, but I wanted to see if you guys had any thoughts as well. So look at Psalm 56. I have a few, but look at Psalm 56. It says, a miktam of David when the Philistines seized him in Gath. So he's running from Saul, and here's what he says in his diary. Be gracious, O God, for man has trampled upon me. Fighting all day long, he oppresses me. My foes have trampled upon me all day long, for they are many who fight proudly against me. When I am afraid, I will put my trust in thee. In God, whose word I praise, in God I put my trust, I shall not be afraid. What can mere man do to me? All day long they distort my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They attack, they lurk, they watch my steps as they have waited to take my life. And that reminds me of him being surrounded by Saul's men at his house. Because of wickedness, cast them forth. In anger, put down the peoples, O God. Thou hast taken account of my wanderings. Put my tears in thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, and Lord, whose word I praise, in God I put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Thy vows are binding upon me, O God. I will render thee thank offerings to thee. For thou hast delivered my soul from death, indeed my feet from stumbling, so that I may walk before God in the light of the living. So that's what he writes, I think, on the way to Gath. But then we get to Psalm 34, which is written, if you look at Psalm 34, flip over there. It says, a psalm of David when he faked madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed, which is the story we just read in 1 Samuel 21, except Abimelech's name was Achish. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be on my mouth. My soul make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear it and rejoice. This is actually one of my personal favorite songs. It's a beautiful song. But it just what I struggle with is it doesn't relate exactly to this story. It's hard to find how this kind of inspired him. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. The poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and rescues him. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. How blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints. For to those who fear him there is no want. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they who seek the Lord shall not be in any want of any good thing. Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves length of days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off from the memory of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and saves them who are crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of all of them. He keeps all his bones. Not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. So I think maybe that he hopes for salvation in Psalm 56. So we read Psalm 56, and it looks like he's coming to the Philistines, hoping that this is the saving plan. He must have immediately realized that was going poorly, because Abimelech, or Achish, says, aren't you the great general who's killed many people? And he decides to act crazy and is delivered, right? So God saves him. So, and then I wrote there, Abimelech is Hebrew for father king. So it might be a title of Philistine kings, because it's used for another Philistine king, the king of Gerar, in Abraham's time. So it's possible that that's just a title, but it is definitely it's definitely an interesting story, because I feel like we're in those 5 verses in 1 Samuel. There must be some big turnaround, and then we get Psalm 34, which is beautiful, right, and very complex and encouraging. But I think it is that same message, that if we that it is the Lord that makes his soul boast, in verse 2, or he seeks the Lord in verse 4, and the Lord answers him. And then in verse 7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and rescues him. And then verse 15, the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous. It's a beautiful psalm, Psalm 34. Psalm 34 is also actually an acrostic psalm. And acrostic means there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And each verse begins with a letter, with one of the letters in that Hebrew alphabet. See, there's 22 verses in Psalm 34. So it's like in our, if you're an acrostic English psalm in the English language, it would be 26 verses. So verse 1 is A or Aleph, and B is Bet, and it goes on like that. So it's a very complex psalm, and maybe that also is an evidence that it was written later in life. It's not written while he's kind of on the run, as we've been talking about, because Psalm 34 is very complex and beautiful, but interesting that it has this tie. That he's tying it back to this time when he escapes from the from the court of Achish or Abimelech. So yeah, these are all the Psalms. We really have run through them. I think it was helpful to read the story first and then look at the Psalm, but seeing how these are David's reactions. But in all this, again, and we'll talk more about it next week as he's in the caves. He could have turned to Saul and fought him and took the kingdom, but instead he chose to run, to escape, and not destroy God's anointed, which we'll look at again. So that's it for tonight. Again, we'll look at David in the caves, the cave of Adullam, which we've already read, next week, and then move on to David in the wedding and David in the temple. So come back. Let me see if I can stop sharing my screen. Yeah. Yep, here I am. Great. So is there any questions or comments at this time?
What was the correction on the David on the Run slide?
1 Samuel 20, verse 40 to 42, not 1 Samuel 21.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to fix that in my slide right now.
I was thinking that maybe the difference between Psalm 56 and 34, because it says it in the title, it was when they seized him. So it's sort of like he's terrified. He thought he'd go there as a refuge. He's terrified, though. They're stalking his steps. They're saying, isn't this David, the guy who they sing about in Israel? And so Psalm 56 is like, they're lurking. They're waiting for me. I don't know what's going to happen. What should I do? And then Psalm 34 might mean God gave him the idea, well, pretend like you're crazy, And so there's that. He's like, oh my gosh, that solved everything. And they're around here anymore. And so, in our lives too, sometimes like we're writing, feeling like it's hopeless. I don't know what to do. There's no way out or whatever. But then just somehow, especially if we're praying about it, God will give us a way of escape. And we're just full of, how did I not think of that before? Thank you, God, for giving me that problem.
Yeah.
It's possible that it could be something like that, because the titles even say that. One is when they've taken him. The other one is when he's feigning madness now. So he's got all the time on his hands to write beautiful songs, because nobody's going to mess with him now. They think he's crazy.
Yeah, no, I think it's a safe reading that that idea, because when you read it just in 1 Samuel 21, you're like, well, he's acting crazy. That's funny. That's kind of a weird reaction. But clearly that was salvation. That idea is what inspired him to write Psalm 34, which is beautiful. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. Because like when I read the story, it says, well, it's odd. It's odd that he decides to act crazy, but that's what gets him out of kind of this barbarian king's throne room. So yeah, I think that's a good observation. All right, well, I'll close in prayer. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Powerful God, we thank you very much for this time to be together. We thank you again for your servant David, the example that he is to us. We thank you for what he wrote in the Psalms. May you keep us safe as we travel to our homes tonight and watch over each one of us. We pray this through your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Good night.
All right, well, thank you again, Levi. We will see you, Lord willing, and hopefully hear you a little better, but it actually worked okay.
Okay, that's good.
Next week.
Yep, we'll see you next week.
Okay, good night.
Good night.